Romans. Whew. Anyone love Romans? Yay! So I had this experience. If you were at School of Discipleship a few weeks ago, there was an elective which was called Paul the Misunderstood Apostle, or something along those lines. And I turned to someone who was sitting beside me and was like, yes, I love Paul so much. And then I was like, guess what? Our church is about to do a series on Romans, and it's my favorite book of the Bible. And then a dear luck member who was right in front of me turns around and goes, what is wrong with you? They said they've never heard anybody say that before. So I am in pretty unique company in this building, I have discovered. So I'm excited. I'm also like a little bit nervous. The book of Romans is kind of like Paul's systematic theology. Now, for those who aren't entirely sure what that is or are familiar with the term, systematic theology is essentially a discipline of Christian theology or study that formulates an orderly, rational, coherent, I don't know if you thought much of that was particularly coherent, account of the beliefs of the Christian faith. It addresses issues such as what the Bible teaches about certain topics, what is true about God and God's universe. Put simply, I think it's impossible to read Romans well without wrestling with and coming face to face with what you believe to be true about God, with what you believe to be true about God's world, and what that actually means for you. How good is that? That's why I love Romans so much. But it's also kind of difficult because there's a reflective journey in Romans. As with all scripture, I believe it can be read at face value, but there's also so much going on. And so what I want to do tonight is maybe a little bit differently to how I usually preach, if you've heard me preach before. Usually in my preparation, I love to read the text and then I kind of read everything around it, and then I do some research and dig into its context and background. And then after sort of doing that, I set that to one side and I try to weave sort of the core of some of what I've found and prayed through and wrestled through into a message that usually is quite devotional, and I use a lot of personal anecdotes. I'm not going to do that tonight. I realized that in order to do that, I would be preaching for like an hour at least to make our way through this one. So in honor of the Uniting Church 20 minutes or less sermon, I have kind of opted for a bit of show and tell through the process of learning about the passage itself. So rather than a sermon, you might think of this a little bit more as a spoken Bible study, one that will largely leave the final step of application to you to think about. What does this Bible study tell you about who or what God is? How does that bring you face to face with what you believe to be true of God and God's world? What does it mean for you today? So in order to do this, I am essentially going to go 3 layers deep into the passage itself, starting with a bit of a fairly high-level flyover, followed by a couple of comments on translation, very inspired by Sunny Chen from School of Discipleship, and then ending in some pretty deep Old Testament lore that Paul kind of casually mentions in a couple of phrases, but they shift the entire focus of what this is about and add so many extra layers of depth to it. So my hope is that if you engage with any of those 3 layers, you'll walk away with something. And so if the thought of language and then diving deep into the Old Testament is terrifying, tune in for the next 6-7 minutes. Thanks, Nick. But my hope is that for those that have the energy and the desire to hang in there through some of the layers that we will uncover together, that you will see that Paul is saying some truly profound and expansive and radical stuff about who God is, what it is that Jesus accomplished on the cross, i.e. stuff around sin and salvation, all those words we love to be terrified of, and be a bit challenged by our comfortable notions of who does and doesn't belong in the family of God. But beginning the flyover layer. This is not the dumb layer, I didn't want to use that word. This is I just need something to think about for the next few days, and that's all I have energy for right now. That's fantastic. Also, it's really hard to understand the next two unless we start here. But now, Paul starts in this passage. This is something different to what comes before. Well, what comes before? Some pretty eloquent stuff about how crap humanity is at our worst and our seemingly inability to change. If you've ever experienced hope that the world, society, your town, or your community are becoming a better place, and then that hope has led to bitter disappointment when you realize that has not come true, this is for you. If you've ever longed to see a change in yourself, something, whether it be a trait that you wish you could release or let go of or stop repeating, yet it keeps showing up, this is for you. But now, in spite of or alongside or instead of all of that, something new is coming. And this something new is apart from the law. What is the law? Well, Paul is writing to the church in Rome. The church in Rome is split between Jews and Gentiles. And so you have Jewish Christians, people who grew up with a book called Torah, which is the law, the first 5 books of our Bible that we read today. And the Gentile Christians did not grow up with that. They are converts into this new faith of Christianity. And that has driven a massive wedge between these two communities. We're not going to dig too far into that tonight, but it's just a good thing to keep in mind. So Torah, the first 5 books, in them contain covenant, God's desire to be in relationship with God's creation. So, but now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed. The fullness and holiness of who God is has been revealed. How? Through the faith of Jesus Christ. Through the faith of Jesus Christ, and it is attested by the law and prophets, the righteousness of God through the faith for all who believe, for there is no distinction. We're going to come back to that. Since all have sinned, another great word, and fall short of the glory of God. We will dive into this a little deeper soon, but for the sake of our flyover read, all humanity, communally and personally, have not perfectly accomplished that covenant relationship with God, have not perfectly lived up to the goodness and the love of who God is. In addition to just thinking of that through actions, which I think a lot of us do if we've grown up in Christian life, you kind of have the list of sins that you can do and you can't do, and you go, oh no, I did one of them again. In addition to that, many theologians argue that there is a falling short in how we perceive God. And so that is falling short of truly understanding, grasping, and living the reality of the goodness and love of God. And so we have maybe a doing problem, but there's also a perception problem. We cannot within ourselves grasp the overwhelming goodness and love of the God we believe in. For all have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. They are now justified, the verse continues, by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through faith. Literally have nothing for you on that, but I do in the next section. God did this to demonstrate God's righteousness because in God's divine forbearance, God passed over the sins previously committed. It was to demonstrate at the present time God's own righteousness, so that God is righteous and God justifies the one who has the faith of Jesus. To kind of like link that to what we're talking about, Paul uses a huge amount of Old Testament language in everything we've just read. And so that's where we get to the third section shortly. But what he's kind of loosely communicating is that something happened through the life and death of Jesus. Something happened through the faithfulness of Jesus and how Jesus lived and died. And he's trying to kind of draw something out of what Jesus actually accomplished while he was on earth. And in addition, he's talking about something in a present state that doesn't really make sense in the present. And so Christians believe in eschatology, which is this idea that at the end of time, all things will be made right and good again, and there will be full and complete reunion between God and creation. And Paul is kind of hinting here that what Jesus accomplished was actually that thing over there. Through Jesus' life and death, he dragged from the end of time into the present moment full and complete reunion with God. I'm not going to talk about how right now, but if that's something you want to reflect on this week, please do. So the passage continues, then what becomes of boasting? It is excluded. Through what kind of law? That of works? No, rather through the law of faith. Jesus did something. If it was that he truly dragged into the present moment reunion with God, is there anything that we can do to bring that about within ourselves? So what is there worth boasting about? Nothing. The something that happened, the something that Jesus did is completely outside of us. And now we are in the family of God again. Where previously there was separation, there is now reunion. And God, through Jesus, somehow did that. If we hold that a person is justified by faith apart from works prescribed by the law, or is God the God of Jews only? Is God not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one. Kind of continues on for a little bit. An important point, there is one God, God of Jew and Gentile, God who is God of us, and God who is God of them. God only has one family, and we're all in it. So it kind of really is true you don't get to choose your family. Do we then overthrow the law through this faith? No. On the contrary, we uphold the law. So do we then throw out all of our attempts and desires and searching and seeking towards discovering the true fullness, goodness, greatness, lovingness of the glory of God? Of course not. It's a worthy pursuit. But that pursuit in and of itself maybe doesn't actually bring about our connection to God's family. It is something we do as part of God's family. All right, so far, there's like so much. We're about to kind of reset and restart. Are you kind of still with me so far? You've kind of walked through the passage from start to finish again. We've unpacked a few things as we go. All right, let's talk about translation. One layer in. We're going to read 3 Greek words, but we won't reread the whole passage yet. But now, something happened, something changed, something shifted and was dragged into the present. But what was it and how? The righteousness of God. Righteousness of God, which has been disclosed and witnessed. The word here for righteousness is dikaiosune. Turn to someone next to you and say, dikaiosune. Dikaiosune. Righteousness, God's righteousness, this idea of being made right. Or, alternatively translated, and some would argue better translated, and if you want to find out more about that, I believe you can listen to this morning's sermon, covenant justice. So God who wants to be in relationship with creation. So the same word, dikaiosune, that's translated here as righteousness, is also translated as God's justice or covenant justice. God who wants to be in relationship with creation creates a covenant with that creation, and it's a covenant of relationship. Breaking of that covenant has consequence, much like any relationship. And so in any relationship, when someone is hurt, we create an opportunity for justice of some kind to enter into the conversation. And so God's righteousness or God's covenant justice, the virtue which gives each their due. Well, how was the covenant justice realized? God's covenant justice which has been disclosed and witnessed by the law and the prophets. How? Through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ for all who believe. Next Greek word, number 2. Turn to someone and say pistis. Pistis. That is translated into English as faith or faithfulness. We go one or the other. There's no second word. So pistis, faith or faithfulness. And there's effectively 2 ways of reading this. There is the subjective view and the objective view, if we were to use literary terms. So in this, the reader or the hearer is the subject, the person who is a part of, immersed in the hearing of the letter. And Jesus, for the sake of literary structure, is the object, the one to whom the letter is talking about. Now, how we apply pistis here dramatically changes the outcome of the passage. And it changes in so many ways how people have experienced church. And some of you may have experienced both applications of this in different settings. If we go with the subjective route, the translation reads, and you'll find both translations in multiple different versions of the Bible, the translation reads, through faith in Jesus Christ. And so it is the faith of the subject, me, in Jesus. If we go objective, the position of faith shifts. Through the righteousness, the covenant justice is achieved through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. Through faith in Jesus Christ, my action, through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, Christ's action. Now, in recent years, translators, without getting into the details of it, have essentially reached the conclusion that the most accurate reading of this is through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. Now, if you have attended a church or you have heard this shared in the context where someone says through faith in Jesus Christ, your entire faith becomes about how good you are at being faithful. It becomes about fitting into a certain tribe or a certain way of being or to a certain thing, and your faith being good enough is the marker of what includes you or doesn't include you in the family of God. If it is the faithfulness of Christ, your level of faithfulness, like it's good to be faithful, but it's also not really about you. Jesus, in one of his parables, kind of refers to a mustard seed, which is like the tiniest possible little, like a grass seed. And says, even if you only had the faith of a mustard seed, that small, you could move mountains. And so many people apply that to like literal miracles. I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying this is about so much more than the puny little faith that you may or may not have to offer. And what I'm doing is so much bigger and more expansive than your imagination currently is. And so Paul, reflecting on that, says that the covenant justice of God is brought about not through how faithful I am, but through how faithful Christ was. When it becomes about how faithful I am, it has caused real harm in church communities. It has been used as a reason to exclude, to judge, to cast out, to shame, because it creates an in-group of the faithful and an out-group of the unfaithful. When it becomes about what Jesus did, it becomes an act for all of humanity. And so we read through Scripture, and in creation, God meets with Adam and Eve, and they establish a covenantal relationship that is ultimately broken, and they're sent out of the garden. And then Abraham and God establish a covenantal relationship that Abraham's descendants break, and we see them sent into exile. There's this like story, literary function that's happening here. And Jesus comes, and when Jesus comes, Jesus as a man is faithful. And so God ultimately keeps both sides of the covenant relationship in order to bring about something in humanity. God never loses God's faithfulness towards us. And through Jesus, fulfills true covenantal relationship and brings about reunification. That's some of what Paul is starting to get at here. Final Greek word. Hilasterion. Hilasterion. Turn to someone and say that. Hilasterion. It is translated here as sacrifice of atonement. Your Bible might say propitiation. Ignore that word. Sacrifice of atonement is wonderful language for it. Another word you might see is mercy seat, which is what is referred to by the sacrifice of atonement. This is where we get deep into Old Testament law. So we'll come back to that. But for the sake of where we are right now, what we are talking about when we talk about the sacrifice of atonement or the mercy seat is the location and the substance of atonement. So we're talking about the thing that Jesus did when Jesus did the thing that he did. And so when Jesus drags that future moment of reunion into the present, that's what we're talking about. And we'll see in the Old Testament why that matters in just a moment. Can we handle one more layer? Yes, okay, great. You had no choice. And to begin our reading again, but for the final time, but now. It doesn't change, but maybe we're starting to see the but now has some significance. Jesus has done something through his faithfulness, his keeping of the covenant of God, his receiving of covenant justice. Through God staying faithful to the covenant of relationship with creation and coming as one of us to fulfill our part of the covenant on our behalf also. The Creator God who so desires relationship with creation that they are willing and prepared to keep both sides of that covenant in order to keep that relationship alive. But now, apart from the law, the Torah. Okay, we're going to turn to some Torah. If you have a Pew Bible or your phone, just prepare to look at Leviticus chapter 16. It's page 91 in the Pew Bible. If you've got your phone, you can find it. Leviticus chapter 16. While you're doing that, apart from the law, the Torah, the righteousness, which is the covenant justice of God, has been revealed and is attested or witnessed by the law and the prophets. The covenant justice of God through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, the moment we refer back to sin. If you have Leviticus chapter 16 open in front of you, suddenly realizing I do not. Leviticus chapter 16, we are picking up in the sort of partway through this passage, but the verse, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, has been used for so much guilt. All have sinned and fallen short. And how do we talk about the punishment of that sin in majority Christian culture? Death. But we go beyond death. This is where often you will hear a preacher, and it's almost impossible for a preacher to talk about salvation and sin and what God was doing without kind of coming into this verse. And it's easy to talk about the violence of Christ's death. The betrayal of his friends, the whipping and the lashing and the crown of thorns and the being put up on the cross, the most violent possible death you could ever encounter. God violently punishes Jesus, a picture of a wrathful God. But we've been introduced to Torah by Paul already, and so we're going to pull out what he's talking about here. There's something pretty incredible when we talk about sin. Verse number 6, if you have that open, Leviticus chapter 16. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots on the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other lot for Azazel. Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord and offer it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness. Here's something you need to know about Leviticus if you've never seen this before. Who's heard of the term scapegoat? So this is where that comes from. Depending on what Bible you are reading and what version, they might even use the word scapegoat. Do you know there is only one animal in the bloody sacrificial system of the Old Testament law? There's only one animal that stays alive. The scapegoat. What was that animal's purpose? Once a year on the Day of Atonement, the sins of the nation would essentially be cast upon the head of the scapegoat, taking upon itself all the sin of the people of God, and then it is not killed in a violent, bloody, and horrible tortured death. It is cast out of the camp. It's made separate. So Adam and Eve break the covenantal relationship and they experience separation. Abraham, the Israelites, the exiles, experience of separation. The Day of Atonement, the way that they commemorate this every year, the sin is heaped on the scapegoat and it experiences separation. Separation from, I suppose, the giver of life. Life being a substance that death is the lack of. I kind of like to think of it like light. Light is a substance where darkness is essentially nothing. Darkness comes not from itself, but from the removal of light. In a similar way, death comes not from itself, but from the removal of life. So sin, its consequence of death, maybe isn't about a wrathful, vengeful, horrible God that is pointing at you and judging you and saying, "How dare you?" But maybe death comes, or the consequence of sin comes, from separating ourselves from the source of life, from the giver of life. So sin then, the consequence is separation. Death is a separation. But what about all the blood? And what about Jesus? They are now justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement, as Hebrews translates the same word, the mercy seat. And you can kind of go back and forth, but they both refer to the same story, which is also Leviticus 16. Sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through faith. You've still got Leviticus open, verse 11. Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall slaughter the bull as a sin offering for himself. He shall take a censer full of coals and fire from the altar before the Lord and 2 handfuls of crushed sweet incense, and he shall bring it inside the curtain and put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat that is upon the covenant, or he will die. He shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the mercy seat, and before the mercy seat he shall sprinkle the blood with his finger 7 times. What is the mercy seat? Mercy seat, so the old temple system basically had the outer courtyard, the inner courtyard, the holy place where a bunch of the temple artifacts were, and then the most holy place, which symbolized the presence of God. In the most holy place, Indiana Jones fans may recognize the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant has a lid. The lid is called the mercy seat. Inside the covenant, inside the Ark, are the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, which are not the complete writings of Torah, but they were the symbol of the covenant, the relationship covenant that God had with God's people in Israel. There's only one problem. Because the covenant was existing in a broken, fractured state, they placed the mercy seat upon it as a cover, almost like something between us and the covenant relationship as a place of protection. And so only on one day of the year could a priest enter the most holy place, and it was the Day of Atonement. And the priest would enter in and sprinkle some blood onto the mercy seat. and that symbolizes purification or cleansing. So blood is the taking of life substance, and then life substance is what purifies and cleanses. It's a bit, but this is the one and only time. And so when Paul then writes, God presented Jesus as a sacrifice of atonement, the cleanser, the purifier, the reunification. On the Day of Atonement, it was the moment in the calendar year that the scapegoat takes the sin away from the camp, and God and God's people are reunited again. Jews and Christians alike believed that in the future time, the end result of what God is doing on earth is full and total and complete reunion with God again. Paul is saying that in Jesus being presented to the world as the mercy seat, the cover that holds us and keeps us in covenantal relationship with God, that has been dragged into the present moment. Now, it's not perfect. We live in a messy world. But reunion with God is possible right now, today. So what about Jesus' experience of violence? I tend to think that in order to be faithful to the covenant, Jesus did not have to go through what he went through. I think the betrayal, the torture, the choice of the most horrific death possible makes a dramatic story, probably helps the spread of the story a bit, but that's actually what humans did to God. That was not God's wrath poured out on Jesus. So then what becomes of boasting? It's excluded. Through what kind of law? That of works? No. Rather through the law of faith, for we hold that a person is justified through Christ's faith apart from the works prescribed by the law. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is God not the God of Gentiles? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one. Final point, I promise we're bringing it home. One more Torah quote, I won't get you to turn to it. But Paul here cuts to the heart of traditional Jewish understanding of God. They had the Shema prayer. I don't know if anyone has heard of the Shema prayer, but you might recognize the words. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. The Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might." Have we heard this before? Some people, maybe? Yep. So this was the key passage for all of ancient Israel. It was their declaration of radical monotheism in a really polytheistic world. That is a declaration that there is one God who is creator, who is in relationship with that creation, who is unifier of all things and brings us all together. And the mission, for lack of a better word, that God essentially gives that group of people through Abraham is to tell the world about it. They don't. They use it to exclude and to cast out in that context. Not all people and not for all of time, but that was the trend. And so we see the exile stories that take place. But this was the key passage, the declaration that God is one. And so Paul turns and says, if your God is one, to Christians who might want to exclude, if your God is God alone, if your God is the one that is worthy of your strength, your valor, your might, your heart, your devotion, your worship, and that God is one, then that one God must also be God of them. And them. And those people over there you're trying desperately not to allow into the family. There is only one family of God. The person that we other, the person we may wish wasn't there, the weird uncle, the unfortunate conspiracy theorist, the intense fundamentalist, the wishy-washy one that makes no sense at all. There is only one family of God. And that should be good news for anyone who's ever felt excluded. You are welcome by the one God to the table in the one family that God is reconciling to themselves. And it's kind of bad news for any who would look to judge or cast aspersion or cast away or exclude. For any who wants to lock down the family to a chosen few and say only those who make sense to me or who look like me or who believe like me or who love like me. God is one. There's only one family of God. We don't really get to choose our family after all. And Paul finishes, do we then overthrow the law through this faith? Do we stop holding each other accountable then? Does it just not matter at all? No. Should we stop reaching towards and for the glory of God? Absolutely not. By no means, Paul writes. On the contrary, we uphold it. We look to Christ. We recognize the sacrifice. So what? I said at the start, I'm going to leave the so what to you. What does this bring up for you? How does it challenge or confuse or clarify your notion of who God is, of what it was that Jesus was doing when Jesus did the thing, of how we read and how we understand? I don't know. But to end on a quote from N.T. Wright, perhaps the most famous Pauline scholar and definitely one of my favorite authors. He says of this passage, God put Jesus forth, Paul seems to be saying, as the place, the location where heaven and earth overlapped, the place where the loving presence of the one God and the faithful obedience of the true human being would meet and merge and be realized together in space, time, and matter. Maybe that's a starting place. What is it that Jesus actually did when he did the thing that he did? Over to you.